that good? So it's an intimate audience today, so feel free to interrupt with any questions you might have. This is kind of a beginner's level talk, but it's some tricks that I learned to get other people to start using tools that I had already written instead of writing their own tools over and over again. So the first thing is there's not a lot of people in this room, but you probably have as many interesting stories as there are people times 3. Submit a talk. It's a great audience, even if it's a small audience. It's a great place to kind of learn how to give talks because the community is very nice. So please do that. So you're probably already familiar with what command line interface is, but the gist of this is we can run this without a mouse, we can run this without a GUI, we can run it without a browser. And any tool that can be run from the command line can then be integrated into an automation suite, which means you may not even need people to run your commands anymore, which means you can go to the pub early, which is really the ultimate goal for anyone working with computers. So this is why command line tools are still around and still prevalent, even though computers have become so beautiful and fancy to play with. There's just some things we'd like computers to do. A few different interfaces to the command line. Curses and end curses provide you with a GUI-like interface on the command line. I don't really spend too much time working with either of these just because they don't give me the ability to automate them as easily as you would be able to automate a simple utility which functions with arguments and input and output. There's also GNU readline, which will enable some cool features for you as well. People that have used GNU command line, readline enabled commands are familiar with command history and such. So that's a really nice interface. There's just basic standard in and standard out. And occasionally, when you're running command line utility, you may not be able to satisfy all of the questions you need to ask the user from that command line. So you might have to prompt them for input and output. It's important to keep in mind the UNIX philosophy. Do one thing well. So don't put too much in a single command line utility. The more complicated it gets, the less likely someone is to be able to understand it and want to use it. So keep it simple, do one thing, do it well. There's other utilities on computers that can help people do things. If you saw the CLI startup thing yesterday, this probably rings true. When you're building a utility, make sure that your default is non-destructive. I like to explore and run commands every once in a while to see what they do, and if your command is going to do something destructive, it's probably not my fault when I run it. So this isn't to say that your default command behavior has to be a complete no-op. If the command is only performing a read-only action, then that's fine to have it run and do its read-only action from the very get-go, because it's going to be okay, and I'm actually going to see the output, and then I can figure out if this thing is even going to satisfy what I need to do. And this also encourages people to work with your tools, because if they're not sure if they're going to run a command that says get user from database, and the last time they ran get user from database, it deleted that user from the database and returned back that user's JSON representation, they're not going to ever run that command again regardless of whether or not you fix it. So make it fun and easy to experiment. You also can't solve everyone's problems all the time, but that's okay. If you enable composability in your tools, you'll enable your users to be able to do what they want with the input and output to your program. When I'm using command line utility, I need to be able to pipe it input from a different utility, a file, wherever, because I may not want to copy and paste in, 1,024 lines of text. If you can, use a columnar data output for multiple rows. This will enable me to use something like auth to be able to easily integrate this into my workflows. And if you can't do that, like if your utility is too complicated and you can't support these types of inputs and outputs, then give me some sort of plugin feature or a script I can run to inject things in. Just follow the UNIX philosophy of doing one thing well as best as you can, and make sure you can go both ways in and out of your program very easily from the command line. So documentation is important. I would say if you want other people to use your utility, make sure your documentation is complete and as clear as possible. It'll even help you. Have you ever written a command line utility like 5 years ago, and then you realize, I think I've already written this before, and you find it, but you can't remember the switches to make it do what you want it to do, and then you have to fire up the editor and read it, what was a 5-second run turns into an hour-long, like, why am I using that module? So just make the docs complete when you start. Then you can say in channel RTFM to the user who's asking you questions, and it's legitimate, and you can go back to doing your job. Always support --help. If you can, support --manual as well, which would be a deeper dive into your utility. And then tell your users where to go to get more information. Maybe it's just come see me. Maybe it's go see this other utility that it's using or calling in the background. But make sure you have that information available that you would want available, that you had available to you when you wrote the utility. And if you're really if you really want to get better at writing and possibly even presenting, go ahead and write a blog post about it. A lot of companies have internal blogs. If not, they have wikis. Treat it like a blog. Write a cool article about it. You don't have to just write boring technical documentation on your wiki. Make people want to engage with it. And this is probably my most frustrating experience with command line utilities. Show me how to use the thing. What do you expect as arguments? Like, I've seen this a million times. Start, stop. When to start, when to stop. Okay, do you want a Unix epoch? Do you want an ISO 8601 formatted date? Is it okay for me to say now minus 5 minutes? Is it okay for me to say yesterday? Is it okay for me to say now? I don't know. And if you haven't provided me with some example use cases of what you're expecting in these arguments, I don't know what to do with it. Also, show me how you run it. When you build the utility, you're building it for a specific purpose. You probably have a command history after you run this utility 10 or 15 lines deep. Copy and paste those into the utility and say examples, and just give those if you've got too much to do and you can't spend time to explain what each one of the examples does. That is perfectly okay. Just give me some examples that this is something that you've done that has been successful, and don't paste in stuff that doesn't work, because that's not going to help any of us. If you can, also show me the output and that you expected that output. That would be really cool as well. Here's something I recently discovered on some of the tools at Craigslist. There are power user modes. Those power user modes are undocumented. When the tools were written, the explanation was, power users should be able to read the source code and figure them out. I don't like the designation of power users. Every one of your users should be a power user. If you're separating people into these classifications, they're going to fall in and stay in those classifications. Document everything. If you have some really cool hidden features, document them. Do you know why? Because when I found these tools, they didn't do what I needed them to do. So what did I do? I wrote a utility that did what I needed to do. Then I find out 3 months later that the original utility supported what I needed, but I'd already started development and bug tracking for a whole new utility. So the original utility by the original author has stagnated because no one's developing it anymore because it doesn't do what they want to be done in the documentation. So that's going to it's going to cause stagnation in your tools. It's going to prevent people from reusing them. And it also ticks me off a little bit. Like, you don't have enough confidence in me to use those extra features. It gets under my skin a little bit, so don't do that. Don't have hidden features, document everything, treat everyone with respect, assume everyone is a power user, and they will become one. All right, so let's talk about writing command line utilities in Perl. How many people write command line utilities in Perl? Yay, everyone does. You might not admit it. But they're prolific and infinite, right? We're never going to stop writing new command line utilities in Perl, so they're going to go on to the heat death of the universe. They range from very specific to very generic. And here's the thing. Like, if you're writing command line utilities, there's a whole namespace in CPAN just for that. It's called app. You think it's boring and stupid, but unless it's written against your company's proprietary infrastructure, we're not snowflakes. Everyone has the same problems. Upload that to the CPAN. It's a great way to get users. It's a great way to get bug reports. It's a great way to find out how people use your utility. And that makes you feel good when you find out that someone's running your code. We are the glue of the internet, so let's keep gluing it together. When you do write tools in Perl on the command line, you should, if you're going to expect user input, you should use the magic diamond. This example uses the double diamond, which is available since Perl 5.22. If you're supporting users before that, you'll have to use the single magic diamond there. But what the double diamond and single diamond both do is give you a way to input a file or a command into the input of your command so that you can chain your commands together on the command line. If you use the double diamond, then you get the added benefit of making sure that whatever command is passed in is taint checked on the way in, so there's no security vulnerabilities. This may or may not be important. If you are writing utilities that will be run as the super user, then I would recommend that you insist on Perl 5.22 or later and use this double diamond operator instead of using the single magic diamond. Get up long descriptive. This is amazing utility. This allows you to describe and validate all of your command line inputs in a single call, and then you get the usage text for free. So it's really helpful. If you're not using get up long descriptive to write command line utilities, you're doing yourself a disservice, because later when you go back to this utility and you're trying to figure out what -n means, is it -no-op, is it -name, what does -n mean? This utility actually forces you to write good documentation from the very get-go. So it's kind of like a lazy way of reminding yourself to write documentation. Here's what would happen if we were to run --help. So we set it up here, and then we have the usage already available to us. So that's very nice. Pod usage is another great utility for being able to put together a more verbose man page. I tend to use these two modules together. There's a little rough edges on them. It's one of the things I'd like to sort out, is making these two things a little bit more integrated so that I can take advantage of them simultaneously. But it's very simple to dump usage information using pod that you've embedded in the document of your script. TermRedline is available. There's a pure Perl version. There's a C version that uses the GNU library if it's available. TermRedline is just nice if you're going to have a prompt in your command, and users are going to be able to do things like a MySQL command prompt to be able to select data from a database or something like that. This will preserve history. It'll be scrollable with the up arrow, and you have support for disabling echoing if you need to prompt for passwords and things like that. There's some other features in here that are really great, but most of the time, those are the only two that I've used in depth. I know this is controversial. There's a lot of crufty old sysadmins who hate colored output, but colored output provides me with additional clues to be able to understand what it is your command is doing and see repeated patterns more easily. So if you can add hints, add hints. Like I said, some users don't like them, but almost everyone is running get these days, right? So in get, there's a color auto variable. So your command line script could peek into that user's .get config and automatically turn on and turn off colors if that's something you want to do. And I highly recommend that. So here's a few honorable mentions about stuff that I use when I'm doing command line utility work. I want to point out PathTiny is pretty much, if you need to do anything with files, file descriptors, directories, searching, PathTiny is amazing. You will be happy. You will write prettier code. You will write more maintainable code, and it will be pretty quick as well. And I wanted to show one other thing because I have this in there, but I don't know that many people work with this. I use Dzil to mint all my releases, and in Dzil I use Podweaver to build all my documentation. So there's this cool thing called collect from other, and basically what happens is when you build the module with Dzil, it will actually collect that section args from this module, CLI Helpers, so long as CLI Helpers is installed in Ink. So if I'm using libraries that add in arguments or add in functionality or have like text that I want to use in my documentation, I can just grab that into my code, and I don't have to rewrite it. So it deduplicates the documentation that you need to write, and that's really amazing. So there's a cool module that I built, I think it's cool, called CLI Helpers. So this is to help you do the things that I just explained. It wraps a whole bunch of stuff. It does some really cool things. We have 5 minutes left to kind of go through it, so I will go as fast as I can. So here we have a simple confirm prompt. Just exports confirm when you use input. There's a few other options as well. So this will do exactly what you expect it to do when you run it. If you say yes, it will die. If you say no, it'll skip. If you wanted to have a menu, it's as easy as saying prompt, and this is the prompt, and here's the menu that I want. This is inspired by IO prompt and IO prompter, but you may or may not know that IO prompt and IO prompter don't work on certain versions of Perl, and they're not backwards compatible. It's a mess, and if you need to support Perl back to 5.6 like I do in some of my utilities, I can't use a module that only works after 5.12. So it's inspired by it and runs on Perl as far back as I can test. Here's the menu that would be generated from that particular thing. So you enter a selection, and until you enter 1 through 7, you'll see the menu. So you can't write in gobbledygook. You can also specify a hash. If you specify a hash, then the value of the hash is the label, and the key is going to be the value that's returned from the prompt function. So in this case, if you were to select north, go north from the menu, the variable dir would be north. You can also do validation. Right now, it's not working with params validate and params validate compiler, but I'm thinking about adding that feature in. But it follows the same sort of pattern that you would expect. So here we're validating an integer. If it doesn't match, you can see we get not an integer, which is the key of that validation hash. There's some really cool output functions. This is the reason why I actually designed this utility, was for the output functionality, which enables you to do some cool stuff. So here's some of the output options that it supports. -- color is an option, but it automatically detects whether or not you have color enabled in your Git config. And if you specify color in your output, it will use the colors, otherwise it will disable them. You can output data to a file. You can output data at different levels. So you have verbosity, you also have debug. You can say quiet if you're running in like a cron tab and you don't want to spam yourself. And then you can use syslog output. And if you use quiet and syslog, the right thing happens. The syslog the data goes to syslog, but it doesn't come out to the command line. So here's just a very simple example. It exports this function called output and verbose. It also outputs one called exports one called debug, and they do exactly what you expect. When you run it without verbosity, you don't get the verbose line, but when you do, you get the verbosity level. There's a few decorators that you can use inside of that hash ref that you pass to make things pretty. So like if you wanted the color blue, then you would run it, and if you didn't have color exported in your Git config, you wouldn't see color, but if you did, or you specified -- color, you would get the color. There's an option called sticky and clear. Clear will give you a new line before it outputs. Sticky will make sure that that line is always output at the end of the run. So there's an end block that runs that will output any sticky lines. So when you run this, even though you've only included that first line once, that this is thanks for my great utility, you get it twice because it's always output at the end. This is useful for error messages when you want to make sure the user can see the error message and you might have a huge screen there. Here's debug, the same thing as before. When we go up to debug, everything is happy. What's nice about debug is you can embed debug calls in all of your modules that you're using, and you can specify debug class, which by default is only main. But if you specify a different class or a comma-separated list of classes, you will also get that list of debug output from those modules. So it's really helpful for doing development of command line utilities using modules that you've written. Here's syslog, very simple. We've all seen syslog before. Quiet does exactly what I said. Doesn't send anything to the terminal and writes this to syslog. If we specify data like this, then this becomes the data output, and we can then specify a data file. You see here, data files test.out, and then after we run it, we only have the data sections. We skip all the headers and such. These are some of the options for the decorators for output. Coming in a new release is going to be tags, so it'll be like data, but it'll also provide you the ability to filter out your output by tags instead of just debug classes and stuff like that. There's more here. Some of the future stuff. After seeing the talk yesterday on CLI Startup, I want to integrate with that so we can provide a full platform for doing really easy, simple, great CLI development. Want to integrate a little bit better with GitOps long descriptive, the tag stuff, and your idea here. This is me. This is off of my GitHub. It's also a meta CPAN already available. I use it in production all the time. I work at Craigslist. We do cool stuff and good stuff on the internet, and we're hiring, so come work with us. That's pretty much all I have to say. Are there any questions? We might have a time for one.